Good morning, everybody. Just glad to be here again this morning. Hope everybody's doing well. We've had a beautiful weather for the weekend for a change, and just hope everybody gets the opportunity to get out and enjoy it. Hope everyone's doing well. If you, as I said every Sunday, if you need anything, please let us know. We'd be glad to try to do anything we can. So just please let us know if you are in need of anything, and hope everybody is doing well during our continued quarantine. So anyway, this morning our Sunday school lesson is entitled Serve. And the point of the lesson is to seize the opportunity to serve. And, you know, as we look now as what we're going through as a country and a nation, and as the world for that matter, there's just countless opportunities to serve others, to be a servant. And so I hope that through this lesson we'll open our eyes and reveal to us opportunities and the needs that we do have to serve others. So anyway, that's the point of the lesson. I don't think it could be more of a pertinent lesson for the times we're dealing with. But you know, the first question that my material has is, when have you received stellar service? And so I know we could all think about times that we've received stellar service, whether it be at a restaurant or whether it be dealing with a business or just any amounts of things. But I just can't help, this question is just so pertinent to what Felicia and I and our family have going on right now. I'm not going to name names, but I sure appreciate every one of you that have come and helped us. The service that our friends and community has given to us is just remarkable. As we've been going through this, trying to get our house back together, and I just cannot thank everyone enough. If you ask about this question is, when have you received stellar service? Well, we certainly have from our friends and family and neighbors, and we're just so very thankful. So I want to start out just say thank you very, very much, and for all the help everyone's given us. But anyway. As we go back to that question, I know all of us can think of times that we've received stellar service. And this idea of serving and seizing the opportunity to serve, obviously my family has been on the reciprocating end of service here the past week. But on the other side of that, hopefully then we can go and serve others as well. But as we look at this and as we get into our lesson, we're going to be looking at Galatians chapter 5, verses 13 through 15. And then we're skipping to chapter 6, verses 1 through 5, and then verse 10 are the verses that we're going to look at today. Just as a little intro into the book of Galatians and into what we're going to be looking at here this morning, the book of Galatians was written by Paul. And it was a letter to the church in Galatia. And as all of Paul's letters, they were just letters of encouragement, instruction, praise to the different churches that Paul had established. And these churches that Paul had established were the first churches that really ever were. They, as I've said so many times before, they didn't have a church doctrine. They didn't have a blueprint, and Paul was instrumental in guiding these churches as they grew and as they began to fellowship and come together to serve the Lord. And so the book of Galatians is another example of that. That I guess as a predecessor to some of the verses that we're going to look at this morning, as we get into this verse 13 of chapter 5. I guess Paul had been talking about what preceded this was there had been a question come up. There were a lot of Jewish Christians in the church of Galatia, and these Jewish Christians had demanded that the Gentile Christians be circumcised because they said that's what you had to do. And so the first part of the book of Galatians was Paul, outlining that being saved and being a Christian had nothing to do with being circumcised or being following any other traditions or customs. That it was this idea that Paul and Jesus had brought about was truly something of the heart and something spiritual, and not something that you could do an outward sign as circumcision was. And so that was kind of what brought these verses on, was this whole Paul contradicting this argument that the Gentile Christians, those that weren't Jews, had to be circumcised. And so as we mention that and then get into our verses this morning, we're going to start in Galatians chapter 5, verses 13 through 15. In verse 13 says, "For brethren, you have been called unto liberty. Only use not liberty for an occasion to the flesh, but by love serve one another. For all the law is fulfilled in one word, even in this, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. But if you bite and devour one another, take heed that you be not consumed one of another." And so verse 13 says, "For brethren, you have been called unto liberty. Only use not liberty for an occasion to the flesh." As Christians, we have been liberated. We've been liberated of sin. We have been liberated of the consequences of sin, if you will. Obviously, we face the consequences that our sin bring in this life, but eternal life and this idea that we can be now reconciled with a holy God, that's the liberty that we have had from what Jesus did for us on the cross. And that is the ultimate liberty. We no longer are in bondage of sin and death. And so we have the liberty, and that's what Paul is talking about. "For brethren, you have been called unto liberty." But then he warns us not to use our liberty for an occasion to the flesh. Not to use this liberty that we have for an occasion to the flesh or an occasion to sin. I've mentioned before in Sunday school, I had an incorrect mindset for a lot of my younger years that, I'm saved, so therefore I can, it don't matter what I do, I'm still saved. It doesn't matter what danger I put myself in or what difference does it make? I'm saved. And, that's what Paul is warning the church of Galatians and therefore us as well. We don't use that liberty for an occasion of the flesh, for occasion to sin. We don't use this statement that, I'm saved so I can do whatever I want to. But instead he encourages us to use this liberty, if we look at the last part of that verse, "But by love serve one another." Use this liberty that we've given to serve one another. Use this liberty not for ourselves, but for who? For others. And that's what he's challenging us to do here in verse 13. He follows that up in verse 14 by saying, "For all the law is fulfilled in one word, even in this, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself." We just talked about this exact verse a couple of weeks ago when we talked about love and how that Jesus' command was that we love one another. And Paul is following suit with almost the exact wording. "For all the law is fulfilled in one word, even in this, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself." So if we tie verses 13 and 14 together, Paul is urging us to use our liberty to serve one another. Use the freedom that we have in Christ. Use the grace that we have in Christ to love, but love, serve one another, to serve one another. And that in doing so, we can fulfill the law, which tells us, "Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself." So he's challenging us to love one another, to love our neighbor as ourselves, and to do it through acts of service and by serving one another. That's very interesting. This word "serve one another" in verse 13, the Greek translation is actually "enslave to one another." Now think about that. if I want to think about this idea of serving another, if I want to think about this idea of loving another, if I want to think about this idea of loving my neighbor as thyself, you want to flip that or not flip it, but compare it to enslaving myself to others. And that's the term that Paul is challenging us as we serve one another to actually enslave ourselves to one another. Now, what does that mean? What does it mean to enslave ourselves one another? If you are enslaved, it means that you have a master. and you work for your master. And Paul is saying that's the relationship that we should have with each other. That we, instead of putting myself in the forefront, I put others in the forefront, and my job, duty is to serve that person, is to be obedient or be in service to them just as a slave would be to their master. He's really upping the odds. I mean, when we think about that, how many times have we thought, well, I've done enough? I mean, I think we've all came to that point. I'm at my wit's end with this person. I'm at my wit's end in doing, and I just continue to do. And yet, Paul says that we're to be as a slave and the other be as our master, that we continue to serve. That's what this idea of loving thy neighbor as thyself. We die to ourselves and put our needs below those of our neighbors, and in doing that and in service as well. Paul then says, but if you bite and devour one another, in verse 15, take heed that you be not consumed one of another. He goes on to say in verse 15, but if you bite and devour one another, take heed that you be not consumed one of another. He says if we don't, there's really two options here. We serve one another, we love our neighbor ourselves, or we don't. And when we don't, he says, but if you bite and devour another, take heed, be wary, be cautious, because if we bite and devour one another, we may be consumed one another. We eventually destroy ourselves, is what Paul is saying. And how very true that is. How would this world be different if we truly put each other's before ourselves? If we truly loved our neighbor as ourselves? If we truly act in service to one another and put ourselves in this position of a slave, and that we enslave ourselves to that other person. And we could change the world. I mean, that's what Paul is trying to get us to do. And some of you are sitting here and the thought even is rolling around in my mind when we talk about this idea of enslaving ourselves to one another. Well, where do you draw the line? I mean, I'm sure somebody, I don't know if anybody of y'all, my little class has thought that, but that's one of the first things that comes to my mind is I'm great with serving other people. I love serving other people, but there comes a point, there's a line that can be drawn. And where do I draw that line? Well, if you think about this word that Paul used for service here in verse 13, this word meaning to enslave. If you were a slave to a master, there was no line that you could draw, right? I mean, he was the master, you were the slave. You did what the master said. You served and did as he said. There wasn't a line that was drawn. And that's the challenge to us. I mean, it's taking it to another level. So many of us are willing to serve, but then yet we are also more than willing to draw a line and say, well, I'm not going to serve anymore. I've done all I can do. I've done more than I should have done. Or I've met my requirements. But Paul's saying, wait a minute, maybe you ain't. Because there is no line that can be drawn. We continue to serve one another. That's the whole idea of loving thy neighbor as thyself. Well, as long as we think about it that way, there is no limit to that love, because obviously we love ourselves. We want the very born nature to survive. And therefore we're going to put ourselves first. But yet Paul's flipping that around to love our neighbor that same way, to put our neighbor first. And then again in verse 15, the warning that if we don't, we can very easily end up consuming one another. That through lack of service, we can consume or let the other die, essentially. And I want to throw out one more point as we look at verses 13 through 15. This whole idea of service, this whole idea of loving our neighbor as ourselves. I can't help but to go back and think of Jesus at the Last Supper. As he washed his disciples' feet. As he got a bowl and washed their feet. And as the ultimate service to these men. We think of it, Christ did that for his 12 disciples. I think about, we talked about last week of Peter and how much I love Peter, how much I can relate to Peter. And, here Jesus bent down and washed Peter's feet. And yet, knowing that a few hours from there, Peter would deny him 3 times. And Jesus knew that. He had already proclaimed that, but before the cock crows 3 times, Peter, you will deny me. And yet Jesus bent down and washed his feet. Think about that. Think about that picture, that image that we have of an example of how we should serve, and let us go out and do it. Anybody, any discussion before we go on? All right. And now we're going to jump ahead to Galatians chapter 6, verses 1 through 5. And verse 1 says, Brethren, if a man be overtaken in a fault, ye which are spiritual, restore such an one in the spirit of meekness, considering thyself, lest thou also be tempted. Bear ye one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. For if a man think himself to be something, when he is nothing, he deceiveth himself. But let every man prove his own work, and then shall he have rejoicing in himself alone, and not in another. For every man shall bear his own burden. And so, Galatians chapter 6, verse 1, it says, Brethren, if a man be overtaken in a fault, ye which are spiritual, restore such an one in the spirit of meekness, considering thyself, lest thou also be tempted. Paul goes on, we were talking about this idea of serving one another. And Paul, he expands this even more. We think of, I think, when I think of serving one another, I think of what's been done, as I mentioned, for our family this week, for electrical work, carpentry work, places to shower. I don't want to mention, but I mean, all these things were these invaluable services that were rendered to me and to my family. And I fail to even think Paul takes this even further. This services that we are to render to one another is this idea of a spiritual service. This idea of correction. This idea of bringing folks back. This idea, the idea of serving one another by offering them grace, by serving one another by opening our arms to them and restoring them. That's a service as well that I think so many times we look over. Actually, I think, just using myself as an example, I think a lot of times we look at faults of others as reasons not to serve them. Is that an accurate statement? I mean, I don't feel like it's just my thoughts that lead me that way. As this world, as flesh makes me think, so many times I think, well, they got themselves into that predicament. They made their own decisions, going back to the old, they made their bed, let them lay in it. We fall back on this mindset when it talks about serving others. It's easy to serve those that we know will serve us back. It's easy to serve those that we like. But it's a lot harder to serve those that we don't agree with, that we don't like, that we like to, I don't know how else to use it, we like to judge. And what Paul is saying here in verse 1, if a man be overtaken in a fault, let's stop right there. If a man be overtaken in a fault, when someone's done something wrong, whether it be against you, whether it be against society, whether it be against the church, Paul says if a man is overtaken in a fault, ye which are spiritual, meaning us that claim to be Christians, restore such a one in the spirit of meekness. Restore that person in a spirit of meekness. You know, that don't mean saying, okay, you come back in, but don't do it no more. Or a week later say, you remember when you done that? That's not a spirit of meekness, right? Restore that person, restore them in a spirit of meekness. And look at what Paul says. He says, considering thyself, lest thou also be tempted. And it goes back to this whole idea, you know, that me as a Christian, I have done nothing to earn that title. I've done nothing to earn salvation. I've done nothing to earn this greatest gift I have. Christ did it all. He's the one that earned it. He's the one that paid all for my salvation. And it's only by His grace and forgiveness that I can stand before you as a saved man, as a Christian. And so when we look at this idea of considering thyself, lest thou also be tempted, it goes back to our lesson last week on forgiveness. If I don't forgive others, God ain't going to forgive me. If I don't forgive others, God ain't going to forgive me. If I continually hold, it says there, considering thyself, lest thou also be tempted. If I don't try to restore others, if I don't restore others in a spirit of meekness, Paul says that I'm going to also be tempted. Meaning that I'm going to fall too. That I'm falling already by failing to restore that person. That's what I take what Paul's saying. That I am being tempted, that I am failing, that I am falling already if I fail to restore that person in a spirit of meekness. Not only restore them, but do it in a spirit of meekness. I don't need to remind them all the time. We need to restore them in a spirit of meekness. And we think about this idea, and we talk about this idea of seizing the opportunity to serve. That is performing a service, right? When we restore folks, we're restoring them. When we restore folks, we're serving them. We're providing a service to them. And that's oftentimes a greater service than anything we could physically do, any help that we could physically give. But providing the service of restoration is more meaningful even than that.
That's a unique look at church discipline, for one thing. But the thing that I like is it's considering thyself, lest thou also be tempted. You're doing it not only for Him, but for yourself.
What a great point, Lon. And in verse 2 it says, bear ye one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. Bear ye one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. I mean, it goes to the law of Christ we just talked about. That we love thy neighbor as thyself. This whole idea of bearing one another's burdens, and so that we can fulfill this law to love our neighbor as ourselves. Bearing another's burdens, again, there's really no limit to that. And we try to put limits on that. And then again, I think this whole idea of restoration, this whole idea of bringing those back that have been overtaken in a fault. This whole idea of continuing to love those that are hard to love. This whole idea of forgiving those that are hard to forgive. You know, all this together is a burden, right? And we're called to bear one another's burdens, to fulfill the law of Christ, to fulfill the law, to love thy neighbor as thyself. And then in verse 3, Paul goes in to why it's difficult. He says, for if a man think himself to be something when he is nothing, he deceiveth himself. For if a man think himself to be something when he is nothing, he deceiveth himself. You know, this whole idea about self gets in the way of so much. You know, we've talked all this past spring quarter about, you know, we talked about messy relationships, and you talk about love, you talk about encourage, you talk about forgive. This week we're talking about serve. You know, the greatest stumbling block we have in each one of those things is ourself. And I think everybody would agree with me. When we put ourselves first, it's hard to love. When we put ourselves first, it's hard to encourage. When we put ourselves first, it's hard to forgive. When we put ourselves first, it's hard to serve. And yet, Paul is saying, if a man think himself to be something, Paul is saying, if you put yourself and you elevate yourself and you think yourself to be something, when we're actually, look what Paul says. He says, when he is actually nothing. And how true is that? It goes back to my statement just a minute ago. You know, I did nothing to earn my salvation. I did nothing. Christ did it all. Therefore, when I am nothing. For if a man think of himself to be something when he is actually nothing, I added the word actually to the scripture, he deceiveth himself. When we get ourselves out of the way, we can serve. When we get ourselves out of the way, we can love. When we get ourselves out of the way, we can forgive. When we get ourselves out of the way, we can encourage. And I think that's what Paul is saying here in verse 3. And then he goes on to say in verse 4, but let every man prove his own work, and then shall he have rejoicing in himself alone, and not in another. For every man shall bear his own burden. And I added verse 5 there. You know, guys, this is ultimately Paul saying, he's paraphrasing Jesus' parable to get the plank out of his own eye before you get the splinter out of your neighbor's. And this is Paul's way of doing that. You know, in the parable Jesus taught, he said that we, you know, I can't remember, and I should have looked it up, but I didn't. But I don't remember the exact circumstance. But essentially, it was Pharisees, and they were bringing about someone's sin. And Jesus' response was, you need to first remove the plank out of your own eye before you remove the splinter out of your neighbor's. And so we compare that to Paul, but let every man prove his own work, and then shall he have rejoicing in himself alone and not in another. He's saying, take responsibility for yourself. You know, we make all these excuses that I've already mentioned earlier. We make the excuse that I've gone far enough. We make the excuse, well, they brought it on themselves. We make all these excuses. But what we're ultimately doing is we're bringing ourselves down. The only responsibility we have is for ourselves. And we have the command to love our neighbor as ourselves. We have our command to love another as God has loved us. We have those commands, and we are responsible to fulfill those commands. And Paul is saying that if I fail to fulfill the command that Christ gives, but yet then I hold any other fault against anybody else, what am I? I mean, I'm a hypocrite. There's no way I can fulfill what Christ has asked me to fulfill when I am not willing to do what he's asked me to do. And so by let every man prove his own work. Paul's saying, take responsibility for yourself. Take your responsibility to love your neighbor as yourself. And then shall he have rejoicing in himself alone and not in another. When I take responsibility for myself to follow what Christ has asked me to do or commanded me to do, and then shall I have something to rejoice about and not in another. Then he goes on to say, for every man shall bear his own burden. And if you're like me, you read verse 5, and then you read verse 2, and you think, wait a minute. Verse 2 says, bear ye one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. Verse 5 says, for every man shall bear his own burdens. Now, does that seem like a contradiction? As you read this, as you read these verses, it seems like just a terrible contradiction, right? But it isn't. Because number one, in the Greek, the words that Paul used for burden here are two very, very different things. In verse 2, bear ye one another's burdens means things, temptation, means outside problems that come and arise. It means, being under the law, being under society. Those are the things, the burdens that are represented in verse 2. But yet, in verse 5, the burdens are the things that only I am responsible for. So think about the difference, okay? In verse 2, the Greek word for burdens means things that I'm not, outside things that are attacking me. Temptation, sin that I'm already involved in, principalities, spiritual warfare. Those are the burdens that are described or that are meant in verse 2. But in verse 5, what Paul is saying are the burdens that it's actually the word as the backpack that a soldier carries, or a ship's cargo that it carries. That's the type of word that burdens mean here. It means something that I'm responsible for. So if what Paul is ultimately saying there is for every man shall bear his own burden, every man shall take responsibility for yourself. If I fail to love my neighbor as myself, whose fault is it? Y'all can answer, please. It's mine, right? If I fail to love my neighbor as myself, it's my fault. That's a burden that only I can carry that I failed to do. Now, if I fail because into temptation, if I fall because of sin and or burdens or outside burdens that have came upon me, if I fall upon them, then those are the burdens that Paul says I need somebody to help me lift up. It goes back to the whole previous lessons. I need somebody to love me. I need somebody to forgive me. I need somebody to encourage me. I need somebody to serve me. And so let's put that all together there. My responsibility, the burden I have to carry, is to love my neighbor as myself. Therefore, meaning that I love, forgive, encourage, serve. Those are the burdens I'm required to carry that only I can do. The burdens I can't do is when I'm tempted, is when I'm in sin, is when outside extremities have come upon me. Those are the burdens I can't carry that I hope that somebody comes in and helps me carry that burden. And I hope that makes sense. I hope that comes across right. And that's what Paul is meaning here in verses 4 and 5. It goes back to this idea of dying as self and dying to myself so I'll serve others. It goes back to this idea of Jesus washing the disciples' feet. It goes back to that picture. It goes back to this picture of Paul's previous verses that I act as a slave to others. That's the way I am to serve. It goes back to this picture of restoring in meekness. Those are the burdens that I have to bear, that I'm willing to do that, to love one another, to love my neighbor as myself. Any discussion, Lonnie, or anyone here?
That each man shall bear his own burden. I've always looked at that particular and comparing the two is, when I face Christ, that last burden is mine. When I face other people around me, that's the burdens that I, you know, so you're looking at, you know, what I can do for these folks as a parent and being responsible for that as opposed to what I'm gonna face Christ with, you know, so I don't know.
No, I think that's a great.
For me, it's three things. It's burdens shared, which you talked about, and burdens bared, which you bear only yourself, and then there's a burden that only the Lord bears, the sin that He carries that we drop at the cross.
Huh. What a great illustration, Mike. I mean,
That's just three things I was thinking of.
and if anyone didn't hear, Mike just gave a great illustration of the three burdens, and he said the burdens that we share, the burdens that we bear, and the burden that Christ took upon Himself on the cross, and
Only He carries.
you know, that only He carries for us. And I mean, that's a great illustration, Mike. Thank you. You know, my Sunday school material says, do you realize that one day you will have to stand before Jesus and answer for the amount of heavy lifting I performed or didn't perform in the lives of others? I must carry my load of service. And I think that's a pretty neat little statement there that's made. Do I realize that one day I will stand before Jesus and answer for the amount of heavy lifting I performed or didn't perform in the lives of others? I must carry my load or service. In our last group of verses this morning is Galatians chapter 6, verse 10. And it says, as we have therefore opportunity, let us do good unto all men, especially unto them who are of the household of faith. Again, it says, verse 10, Galatians chapter 6, verse 10. As we have therefore opportunity, let us do good unto all men, especially unto them who are of the household of faith. We see this very simple command. You know, I always, when all of y'all that's been in my Sunday school class for all these years, you know that I say, Lord, mercy, Paul, if I could just understand everything Paul wrote. And it's so many times you just struggle, and Paul, you know, I do. I struggle understanding and getting the exact meaning. But there ain't no struggle right here. It says, as we have therefore opportunity, let us do good unto all men. Again, I can't help, and I do this all the time in teaching, but it says, let us do good unto all men. It doesn't say some men. There's no asterisk there. There's no ifs. There's no ands. There's no ors. It just says, let us do good unto all men. And when should we do that? As we have therefore opportunity. Every time that we have an opportunity, we are to do good unto all men. Not some, not most, but to all. But then Paul takes it even further there, and he adds this. He adds this caveat. He says we're to do good. We're to do good unto all men. But then he says, especially unto them who are of the household of faith, especially our Christian brothers. And you know, as I mentioned at the very beginning of our lesson, this whole book, this whole group of verses, all started from the Jewish Christians adding burdens onto the Gentile Christians. Now, what Paul is saying is we are to do what to other people's burdens? Take them away, right? But yet, the Jewish Christians were doing what? They were adding burdens. They were doing the exact opposite. And so therefore, as Paul, as a way to wrap up our lesson, as a way to wrap up this idea of seizing the opportunity to serve, you know, we're to do good to all men, but we are especially to do good to those of our Christian brothers and sisters. You know, so many times this whole idea, going back to verse 1 of Galatians chapter 6, brethren, if a man be overtaken in a fault, ye which are spiritual, restore such a one in the spirit of meekness. It goes back to that idea, right? Because so many times, if it's a Christian brother or sister, and they fall in sin, do we go to restore or do we go to gossip? Do we go to restore or do we go to point fingers? Do we go to restore or do we go to judge? And I think that's what Paul is saying. You know, we are to do good to all men, but especially our Christian brothers and sisters. You know, those are the ones we really need to try to be restoring. Meekly, as Paul said. Those are the ones that we need to step out. We need to be bearing their burdens. Not that we don't care about all men, because Paul makes it very clear that we should. Jesus Christ makes it very clear when he says we are to love our neighbor as ourselves. It ain't saying loving our Christian neighbor. It ain't saying loving whatever neighbor. It ain't saying love the neighbor that loves you. It says to love our neighbor as ourselves. I'm not trying to say we're not supposed to do good and to love only our Christian brothers. That's because that is as false can be. But what Paul brings out is that we are to especially those that are the household of faith. You know, and we could go into lots of detail about why that is so important. But you know, there's a lot of folks that aren't sitting in a church pew no more because we as Christians failed at what Paul is saying right now. I mean, would y'all, God, everybody's nodding their head, so I think it's a true statement. Because we fail at what Paul is saying. And you know, when somebody leaves the church, I'm not saying welcome home church, I'm saying when somebody leaves the church because the church was unwilling to restore that person, that's sad. That's a hard blow that we take upon ourselves as a church when that doesn't happen. So as we look at this idea of service, the services that we can render, the physical services that we can render are so very important, and they mean so much. But yet they lack in the amount that the spiritual services that we can render make a difference. And I hope that makes sense. You know, we don't only need to be willing to serve physically with material things, money, time, but we need to be willing to serve spiritually. And to do that, we have to be willing to restore. We have to be willing to restore anyone, to forgive, to encourage, to love, but especially those of the household of faith. And I think that's how Paul concluded this, and I think that's how I'm going to conclude it. There was one question, question 4. And it asked, what does carrying one another's burdens look like? What does carrying one another's burdens look like? Does anybody want to share, Lonnie or April or Mike or Macy or Brian? Would y'all want to share an example in y'all's mind of what carrying one another's burdens looks like?
Jason, it might look like just praying for somebody. Mm-hmm. It might actually look like going in and talking with them and providing whatever they might need in some way. It may involve spiritually the restoration of somebody that has sinned, you know, and working with that person to publicly admit, you know, their need and that sort of thing. So it can take a lot of different forms.
I think that's a great point, Lonnie. Anybody else want to share? Well, guys, you know, when you think about this idea of what does carrying one another's burdens look like, I mean, I want us to think about that this week, because whose burden can we carry? Obviously, as Paul said, we need to make sure that we're carrying our own burdens, the burdens that we're responsible for, but then keep our eyes open as to whose burden can we help carry and help
Jason,
restore.
that last verse, verse 10, you know, you'd almost look at it and say, well, Paul is making a difference between people. Okay, he's elevating Christians above all men, and to a degree he is. You know, the Bible, an underlying principle is charity begins at home. You know, but we help other people as far as that's concerned. So, you know, that's a point that we need to make. But I think, as you have very well said, you know, we gotta take care of our brothers and sisters, but that doesn't leave anybody else out.
Well, thank you, Lon. Well, guys, as I've done the last couple of weeks, it's, you know, our material has the last page. It says, live it out. And it says, where is God leading you to serve? It says, with family. It says, be intentional about blessing your family members this week. Make an extra effort to serve the people you love the most. Then it says, with church, it says, search for a specific way you can minister to your brothers and sisters in Christ. As a group, identify individuals whom you can walk alongside and help ease their burden. And then it says, in the community, think through your gifts and resources, and then find a need in your neighborhood or community that corresponds with those gifts and resources. Start a service project or engage a long-term ministry. It says take action. So the three places that we're challenged to serve this week is in our family, in our church, and in our community, those around us. So just I encourage us all to look for those opportunities this week as we wrap up this morning. And I do appreciate everyone. I look forward to being with you next week. Our lesson next week will be talking about yielding. So as we talk about dealing with messy relationships, with the point of the lesson being yielding. So that's sure to be a good lesson as well. So I encourage and hope everybody can be with us then. Thank you very much, and God bless you.